You should go home." My son said it right there on the wedding dance floor while I was still holding a glass of champagne I hadn't even set down yet. Not whispered, not softened, not apologized for. Just 4 words, enough to push me out of the room where I had paid for every flower, every song, every forced smile that day. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She didn't say a word, just smiled, a very slight smile. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a wedding. This was an erasure. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I stood frozen for a few seconds, as if someone had pulled all the air out of my lungs. The music kept playing behind me, a soft jazz tune from the live band, the trumpet weaving through the cheerful chatter of hundreds of guests. Silk dresses brushed across the polished wooden floor. Glasses clinked together, bright and celebratory. No one noticed me. No one knew that, in that exact moment, I had just been pushed out of my own son's life. My name is Judith Monroe, 63 years old, a widowed mother who has spent more than half her life in Colorado in an old log house sitting on land my family has protected for 3 generations. I used to think I was a strong woman. I believed there was nothing left that could break me. After my husband died 12 years ago, after endless overnight hospital shifts, after crying while paying my son's college tuition bills. But I was wrong. Ethan's wedding, my only son, was held at a luxury resort in Napa Valley, more than 8 hours' drive from my home. Claire said she had always dreamed of a vineyard wedding, where the afternoon sun fell across long tables dressed in white linen, where everything looked like it came straight out of a lifestyle magazine. I nodded the moment Ethan asked if I could help cover some of the cost. In truth, it wasn't some. I paid most of it. I didn't tell anyone that to come up with that money, I drained nearly all of my retirement savings. I didn't say that I picked up extra night shifts at the hospital even when my back hurt so badly I had to lean against the wall just to stand upright. I didn't say that I kept telling myself, this is the last time, the last gift for my son. A mother shouldn't keep score, right? At least that's what I believed. I arrived 2 hours early on the wedding day. The California weather was gently sunny, warm, the scent of ripe grapes drifting in the air. I wore a navy blue, knee-length dress, classic, understated, the exact style Claire had sent me months earlier with a short message, "Formal attire only." The dress cost nearly $400. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time that morning, wondering if I was trying too hard. Then I smiled at myself. The groom's mother should look the part, I thought. The ceremony was flawless. Claire walked down the aisle between rows of white chairs, her fitted lace gown, her blonde hair pinned neatly like a princess. Ethan stood at the end, shoulders straight, eyes bright. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I cried. I cried out of happiness, out of longing for my husband, who wasn't there to see this day, and out of a naive belief that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. After the ceremony, the reception began. I stood near the dessert table holding my champagne glass, watching Ethan laugh with his friends. I was waiting for a quiet moment to give him the envelope I had brought. Inside was a check I had signed the week before, my hand shaking so badly I had to sign it twice to keep the letters straight. I imagined hugging him, whispering how proud I was. That moment never came. Ethan walked toward me, his face tight. Not the stress of a busy groom, but the firmness of someone who had already made a decision and didn't intend to change it. When he said those words, "You should go home," I thought I must have misheard him. I gave a small, awkward smile, about to ask him to repeat himself, but his eyes left no room for doubt. "Claire is uncomfortable," he added, his voice lower but cold. "You're stressing her out." Around us, everything continued as normal. A middle-aged man tried to dance near the stage, making a few people laugh. A server bent down to straighten a tablecloth. No one looked our way. And maybe that was what hurt the most. I was being kicked out of my son's wedding, and the world didn't even pause for a breath. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to remind him that I hadn't said a single word to Claire all evening, that I had tried to turn myself into a shadow just to avoid bothering anyone. I wanted to scream that I was his mother, that I had paid for every detail in that room. But nothing came out. I looked at Claire. She was seated at the head table, one hand resting lightly on her wine glass, her lips curved into a small, very small smile. No one else would have noticed anything in it, but I did. I had lived long enough to recognize victory when it hid behind perfect politeness. I nodded. Just a very slight nod. I set my champagne glass down on the dessert table. The base touched the glass surface with a soft, sharp click. I turned, picked up my purse, and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't search for my son's eyes one last time. I was afraid that if I did, I would collapse right there. The path to the parking lot was long and bright with sun. My heels struck the stone in steady rhythm. Each step felt like a countdown. When the large doors closed behind me, the music and laughter were cut off abruptly. All that remained was silence and the distant sound of cicadas. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, forcing my shoulders not to shake. I had left many places in my life. Left the emergency room after overnight shifts, left the cemetery after my husband's funeral, left old rental houses when Ethan was young. But never had I felt erased like this. When I got into the car, my hands tightened around the steering wheel without thinking. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there looking back at the glowing resort in the late afternoon light. Inside, my son was raising a glass to his future, and I, the woman who had built the foundation for that future, was left on the outside, like an unnecessary detail. I started the car and drove away. The road out of the valley wound through endless rows of vineyards. The setting sun painted everything in soft shades of gold and orange. It should have been peaceful. But inside me, something was slowly freezing. Not a burst of anger, but a cold, terrifying clarity. I began connecting the dots. Claire's subtle remarks in the months before. The way she always stepped in whenever Ethan and I tried to talk privately. The annoyed looks when I asked about his plans for the future. And then today, "You should go home." It wasn't an impulsive decision. Not wedding stress, not a small misunderstanding. It was the result of a process I had refused to see because I trusted motherhood too much. I drove for hours until the sky turned fully dark. With every mile, a thought took shape in my mind, slow but steady like tires rolling along the highway. If I could be erased from my son's wedding today, what would I be erased from tomorrow? The question echoed again and again like a warning, and I had no idea that only a few hours later that question would become real, in a way I could never have imagined. I drove that long stretch in a strange state, not crying, not shaking, not panicking, just a deep emptiness, as if someone had finally lifted a heavy stone I had carried on my chest for years, leaving my ribs exposed, aching, but also lighter in a strange way. The highway grew emptier. Long lines of yellow light stretched endlessly, like a chain of memories I had tried to neatly fold away throughout my years as a mother. And then, almost by instinct, I began thinking of Ethan from long ago. Not the man who had just asked me to leave his wedding, but the small boy who used to grip my hand tightly when our world fell apart. My husband died when Ethan was 11. It was a winter morning, snow still dusting the lawn in front of our house. Marcus, my husband, collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee, a fast, merciless heart attack that gave us no chance to say goodbye. I still remember the sound of the ceramic mug shattering on the tile floor, Ethan calling for his dad as he ran downstairs, and the heavy silence that followed, the silence that told me nothing would ever be the same again. I became a single mother in the span of one morning. The years that followed blurred into a long stretch without pause. I worked as a nurse at a local hospital, first-day shifts only. But Marcus's life insurance wasn't enough to last, and the mortgage was still there. I took evening shifts, then nights. There were weeks when I worked 6 days straight, 12 hours a day, coming home after Ethan was asleep and leaving again while he was still groggy at the breakfast table. I missed so much. Parent-teacher meetings I attended in my scrubs, school performances where I stood at the back of the auditorium, afraid Ethan would see how exhausted I was. But I never missed the most important thing, being there. I was there when he was sick, when he was bullied at school, when his first real heartbreak left him crying in his room for an entire evening. I learned how to be both mother and father, even though I never believed I was good enough at either. I remember summer evenings when Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, books spread everywhere. I made tea to stay awake while he worked through math problems, brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes I was so tired the words on the page blurred, but I stayed, just so he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I remember all the times I said no to myself. No new clothes, no vacations, no renovations I wanted to make to the house. Everything went into Ethan's college fund. When his acceptance letter arrived, I held him and cried, not from pride, but from relief. I had done it, at least up to that point. When Ethan met Claire, he was 26. I first met her over dinner at our house. Claire was polite, proper, but there was an invisible distance I couldn't name. She spoke softly, her smile always measured. Never more, never less. I told myself it was just her personality. Not everyone is warm, and I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law. I tried to keep myself on the edges of their lives. I didn't give opinions unless asked. I didn't show up unannounced. I didn't bring up the past. I thought that was respect. But there were small signs I chose to ignore. The way Claire hesitated when I entered a room, how she gripped Ethan's hand a little tighter whenever I asked about their plans, the short, polite but distant replies, as if every conversation with me was an obligation to be completed. When they announced their engagement, I was genuinely happy for my son. When Ethan asked if I could help pay for the wedding, I didn't hesitate. I thought it was an important milestone, something I should contribute to so he could start well. I didn't tell Ethan that the amount was far more than I had expected. I sat down with an old notebook and added everything up. I withdrew from savings. I took out a small loan from the local credit union. I sold my old car and bought a cheaper one. I cut back on things that seemed small. No eating out, no new books, no weekend coffee. I told myself I would make it up later, after the wedding, after things settled. Each time I transferred money to the event planners, Claire sent a short message. "Thank you, Judith." No emojis, no follow-up. I reread those words and told myself I was being too sensitive. A few weeks before the wedding, I began to feel unnecessary. The big decisions had already been made. I was informed, not consulted. When I made a very gentle comment about the location, only that it might be far for older relatives, Claire smiled and said, "We've already decided." Not harsh, but final. I swallowed the rest of my words. I kept soothing myself with a single sentence, repeated like a prayer. As long as my son is happy, that's enough. I said it to friends, to relatives, to myself. I believed motherhood meant stepping back when needed, letting go at the right time. I believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, everything would be fine. The truth was, I didn't realize I was being pushed out, little by little. When the wedding day arrived, I thought all the small tensions would disappear, that it would be a day about love and family. I prepared myself to smile, to stand behind the scenes, to be the kind of mother I was supposed to be. Quiet, proud, undemanding. I never imagined I would be asked to leave. Now, driving through the darkness, I began to see every piece with new clarity. Details I once thought harmless arranged themselves into a picture so clear it made my skin go cold. I realized I had confused sacrifice with self-erasure. I believed love meant giving without conditions, but I had never asked, what happens when that giving is no longer valued? I didn't know then that the wedding was only the first step. But as my tires rolled steadily over the road and old memories settled into silence, a sense of unease began to grow, slow, heavy, impossible to shake. Something was coming, something bigger, colder, and deep down I understood that the price I had paid for that special day was not the final price yet. I kept driving through the night, letting the road pull me farther away from that glowing vineyard valley. My headlights swept across road signs, dark rows of trees standing still on either side of the highway. The dashboard clock crept closer to midnight. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing, the steady hiss of tires on dew-damp pavement. At times I felt like misplaced luggage on the wrong conveyor belt, pushed along, left behind, no one looking back. The feeling didn't explode into anger or spill into tears. It lingered, stubborn and dull, like a bruise beneath the skin. I thought about the moment Ethan spoke those words, about the way his eyes avoided mine, about Claire's barely there smile. It all replayed in my mind without sound or color, leaving only the cold shape of the truth. I stopped at a small roadside gas station to refuel. The convenience store glowed under fluorescent lights, smelling of burnt coffee and stale pastries. The young cashier smiled out of habit as I handed over my card, unaware that the woman standing in front of her had just been erased from a family she herself had built. I bought a bottle of water, took a small sip, then set it on the passenger seat. My throat was dry, but I wasn't thirsty. I just needed to pause long enough to prove to myself that I was still moving forward, that the wheels were still turning. When I pulled back onto the road, the air grew cooler. The highway gave way to narrower roads winding through pine forests. I recognized the familiar scent of the mountains, sap, damp earth, night air heavy with mist. That smell guided me home, faster than any road sign ever could. And then after the final bend, I saw the old wooden gate appear in my headlights. The house stood there, as it had for decades, unpretentious, unpolished. Just a 2-story log house with a sloped roof, a wide porch, and the warm yellow glow of the porch light I always left on when I traveled. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. The silence here was different from the silence on the road. It wasn't empty. It was dense, deep, filled with memory. I stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under my heels. The cold air raised goosebumps on my skin, but I didn't rush inside. I stood there, looking at the house the way you look at someone you love after a long absence. Dark windows, the wooden porch swing creaking softly in the night breeze. Everything familiar, painfully so. This wasn't just a house. This was where my grandfather stood every morning with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the mountains. This was where my father hammered each plank of the barn out back, sweat dripping onto the ground in the heat of summer. And this was where Marcus and I carried Ethan home from the hospital, a tiny bundle wrapped in white, crying when the cold air touched his cheeks. This land, 40 acres, was the greatest emotional inheritance of my life, not because of its market value, though I knew it was worth a great deal, but because every inch carried the footsteps of people I loved. Every tall oak at the forest's edge was planted by my father when I was still a girl. Every wooden fence bore my grandfather's hammer marks. And this house. Marcus repaired the porch roof with his own hands in the final autumn before he passed. I opened the door and stepped inside. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I let myself stand in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the space. The smell of old wood, the soap I used to mop the floors, the faint warmth left behind from a long day. All of it wrapped around me like an invisible blanket. I set my bag down on the chair and hung my coat on the hook by the door. Every movement was slow, as if I were afraid of disturbing the fragile quiet that covered the house. I walked into the living room. The armchair Marcus used to sit in was by the window. The coffee table had an old scratch on the corner, where Ethan once dropped a toy car when he was little. On the mantel were photo frames faded by time. I didn't look closely, but I knew every picture there. I didn't need light to see them. I sat down in the armchair, my hand resting on the armrest worn smooth by years of use. In that moment, the memory of Marcus felt so vivid, I could almost hear his voice, low, slow, always carrying a hint of a smile even when he talked about serious things. I clearly remembered the last night we sat here together, talking about the future. Ethan was already grown then, getting ready for college. Marcus worried that I would struggle on my own if he were gone. I brushed it off, told him he was thinking too much. "Judith," he said, his voice weak but firm. "No matter what happens, you have to hold on to this land. Don't let anyone turn it into something that can be bought and sold. It's our family." I nodded. Back then, I never imagined that promise would become so heavy. That night, I didn't cry. The tears felt stuck somewhere, refusing to fall. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening only to the steady ticking of the wall clock. Each tick sounded like a step backward in time, carrying me to the years when I still believed family was something nothing could shake. I made a cup of tea, but let it go cold on the table. I didn't feel like drinking it. I just needed something in my hands to remind myself that I was still here, in this house, on this land. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees, creating a familiar whispering sound. Normally, that sound comforted me. Tonight, it made me feel smaller than ever. I stood up and stepped out onto the back porch. The night sky stretched wide, full of stars. Pale moonlight fell over the distant field, where wild grass swayed gently. I remembered summer evenings when Ethan ran barefoot across the lawn, laughing as Marcus chased after him. I remembered the sound of Mom calling out from far away, full of trust. Those memories didn't come to comfort me. They came to remind me that something had changed forever. A vague but unmistakable sense settled in my chest. What happened today wasn't the end. It felt like the first crack of thunder signaling a storm forming far offshore. The surface was still calm, the sky still clear, but the air had changed. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned the lights off again. I didn't want light. I wanted the house to stay like this, silent, waiting. I went upstairs, changed my clothes, and lay down on the bed without pulling the covers up. The ceiling appeared dimly in the moonlight slipping through the curtains. I stared at it for a long time, letting my thoughts drift without clinging to any single one. Before slipping into a shallow, restless sleep, a thought slid into my mind, light but sharp as a blade. If my son could throw me out of his wedding, what else would he be willing to take from me? I didn't know the answer, but somewhere deep inside, I knew that the calm of that night was only a thin shell, and I was afraid, not of the dark, not of being alone, but because I was beginning to understand that the real storm was still ahead. I woke up just as the sky began to lighten. Sunlight, thin as a veil of mist, slipped through the curtains and fell onto the cold wooden floor. My body felt heavy, not from lack of sleep, but from a deep weariness inside, as if I had carried an invisible weight through the entire night. I sat up slowly, set my feet on the floor, and listened as the house woke up with me. The soft creak of wood, the wind slipping through the window frame, the first birds calling from the distant pine trees. Everything looked normal, suspiciously normal. I made coffee, a habit I never broke. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. I leaned against the counter, mug in hand, and looked out the back window. Dew still clung to the grass. The old wooden barn stood quiet in the distance. There was no sign that the day before I had been pushed out of my son's wedding, as if it had all been a bad dream washed away by morning light. My phone vibrated just as I set the mug down. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I thought, naively, that he was calling to apologize, that he had reconsidered after his wedding night, that he realized what he had done was wrong. My heart skipped, not because of grand hope, but because of the old reflex of a mother always ready to forgive. I answered. "Hi, Mom," Ethan said, his voice so normal it stopped me short. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no trace of the emotions I had carried all night. "Did you make it home safely?" I was silent for a second. "Yes," I said. My voice was dry but steady. "I'm home." "Good," he continued, as if checking something off a list. "Hey, Mom, do you have a minute to talk?" I looked out the window again, where sunlight had begun to touch the trunk of the old oak tree. "I'm listening." There was a very brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his tone turning strangely upbeat, like when he was little and about to share a new idea. "Claire and I talked last night. We think it's time to talk about the land." I frowned but said nothing. "The land paperwork," Ethan went on a bit faster, as if afraid I might interrupt. "Can you send me a copy? Or better yet, the original? I need to look it over." It felt like someone had just dumped a bucket of cold water over my head. The paperwork. "For the land?" I repeated, not to question him, but to give myself time to understand what he had just said. "Yeah," he replied casually. "Our land. The 40 acres. I figured you knew what I meant." I leaned back against the counter, my hand gripping the edge of the marble. Part of me still couldn't believe this conversation was happening. Less than 12 hours after I'd been told to leave his wedding, my son was calling to ask about property documents. "What for?" I asked. My voice was low and even, unfamiliar even to me. Ethan let out a small, relieved breath, as if we had finally reached the important part. "Well, to talk plans. You know, leaving land unused is a waste. Claire and I think we could develop it." "Develop it?" I repeated. Yeah, he said, growing more animated. Build a few houses, maybe divide it into lots. Sell them. The market is really good right now, Mom. People are willing to pay a lot for land like that, especially near forest and mountains. I closed my eyes. The image of the old barn, the crooked fence, the oak trees my father planted appeared so clearly it hurt. Ethan, I said slowly, you're talking about our family land. I know, he replied, still calm. But look at it, Mom. It's too much for one person. Maintenance is exhausting, and you're not young anymore. That sentence, you're not young anymore, landed like a clean cut, not cruel, not angry, just a truth spoken too easily. Claire and her family know some people in construction, Ethan continued. Her dad has a friend in real estate. Her uncle did a similar project in Arizona. We've already talked it through a bit. If we move fast, we could split the land, build vacation-style homes, and sell them in a few years. I opened my eyes. The familiar kitchen suddenly felt foreign, like I was standing in someone else's house. So, you've already planned everything? Not exactly, Ethan said quickly, correcting himself. Just preliminary talk, to see what you think. I gave a soft laugh, empty of humor. Are you asking me, or informing me? There was a brief silence. Then Ethan said, his voice lower, more practical. Mom, I just want what's best for everyone. This is a big opportunity. If it sells, you'll have money to live more comfortably. You could move somewhere smaller, easier to manage. I pictured myself in a senior living community, trimming artificial grass, playing bingo on Wednesday afternoons. I pictured this land leveled, the oak trees cut down, the barn dismantled, all of it wrapped up in 2 words, big opportunity. What does Claire think? I asked, even though I already knew. She's very supportive, Ethan answered immediately. Her family, too. Everyone thinks this is the logical move. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. The final pieces fell into place. The lavish wedding, my quiet removal, this morning's call. Nothing was scattered anymore. It all lined up into one cold, straight line. So, Ethan continued, his tone slightly pressing, can you send the paperwork this week? So we can review the details. I took a deep breath. The morning air suddenly felt heavy. Do you know, I asked slowly, that your grandfather spent nearly his entire life holding on to that land? I know the history, Mom, Ethan replied, a hint of impatience creeping in. But we have to live in the present. We can't cling to the past forever. That sentence ended all remaining doubt inside me. The wedding wasn't the destination. It was just a stepping stone, a stage dressed up, beautifully enough to hide the real goal behind it. And I, the mother, was simply an obstacle that needed to be removed so the plan could move forward smoothly. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out, the skin thin with age. These were the hands that had changed bandages, given injections, worked without rest. The hands that had held my son's hand when he was afraid. And now these same hands were being asked to give everything away. Ethan, I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. I need time. Time? He repeated. How long? For now, I said. I'll think about it. There was a light sigh on the other end. Fine, but think fast. The market doesn't wait for anyone. I ended the call before he could say anything else. The kitchen fell silent again. The wall clock ticked steadily, reminding me that time kept moving, no matter what had just happened. I stood there for a long while, watching sunlight slowly fill the room, touch the table, the cabinets, the old photo near the door, the one of Marcus standing on this land, smiling gently, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder when he was still a boy. I realized then that a mother's love can be weighed and measured like any other asset. And that morning in my familiar kitchen, I understood that I hadn't just lost my place in my son's wedding. I had been placed on the scale. After that call, I didn't do anything right away. I didn't call Ethan back. I didn't text him. I just stood in the kitchen for a long time, letting the wall clock keep counting seconds as it had for decades. Then I put on my jacket and stepped outside. Mornings on this land always had a beauty of their own. Sunlight cut through the pine trees at an angle, falling onto ground still damp with dew. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wild grass and sap. I walked slowly along the familiar dirt path leading to the field behind the house. Each step felt like it was pulling me backward through time, returning me to days when everything here was tied to the voices of people long gone. My grandfather bought this land in the early 1950s. He had just returned from the war, carrying nothing but a small amount of money saved from years of hard labor. He chose this place because it was wild, because people thought no one would want to live on land so remote, rocky, and forested. But to him, it was a beginning. He built a small log house with his own hands, planted the first trees to mark the boundaries. He told my father, "Land won't betray you as long as you don't betray it." My father grew up here. He expanded the house, built the barn, put up fences. He planted oak trees along the small creek, believing that one day his grandchildren would sit beneath their shade. When I was a child, I thought this land was the whole world. I ran barefoot through the grass, scraped my knees, got bandaged by my father, then ran off again. Every scratch, every scar belonged to a specific corner of this land. They never disappeared, only faded with time. Marcus, my husband, fell in love with this land the first time he stepped onto it. He wasn't born here, but he chose to stay. He repaired the roof, reinforced the foundation, expanded the front porch. He planted fruit trees, saying Ethan would grow up alongside them. And when Ethan was born, this land witnessed my son's first steps, his laughter echoing across the fields. All of that. Those afternoons, those long winters, those sweltering summers couldn't be measured in money. They had no market price. No contract recorded them. But they existed, clearly and stubbornly, in every layer of soil, every piece of wood, every memory I carried. And yet, in that morning call, Ethan had called it unused land. I replayed those words in my mind one by one like a slow knife. Unused land. As if this place were nothing but an empty space waiting to be filled with concrete and profit. As if the years my family poured sweat, tears, and even blood into it had never existed. I walked up to the old wooden barn. Some of the boards were weathered, but the structure was still solid. My father used to say that if you build something carefully from the start, it can last longer than a lifetime. I placed my hand on the rough wooden wall, feeling each small crack beneath my fingertips. This wasn't unused land. This was living history. When I turned back toward the house, my phone vibrated again. Ethan. I hesitated, then answered. "Have you thought about it yet?" he asked immediately without easing in. "I'm standing on the land right now," I replied, my voice lower. "The land you called unused." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his voice carrying restrained irritation. "Don't make this complicated. I'm just talking realistically." "Your reality," I said. "The market's reality," he corrected. "Look at it, Mom. You're here alone. Maintenance costs money. The grass grows wild, the barn is old. Everything needs fixing. You could live more comfortably if you moved." "Moved where?" I asked, even though I already knew. Claire found some really nice senior living communities, Ethan said, his voice softening in a forced way. They have care services, activities, social events. You wouldn't have to worry so much anymore. It would be better for you. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I saw myself packaged into a future someone else had designed. Neat, convenient, out of the way. An older woman who needed to be placed so she wouldn't interfere with younger people's plans. "How long have you been talking about this with Claire?" I asked. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. That silence was answer enough. "We're just thinking about the future," he said afterward. "Yours too." I let out a short laugh, this time without bitterness. It was low, brief, final. "You're thinking about your future," I said, "and I'm just an inconvenient variable." "That's not true," Ethan protested quickly. "You're reading into it. You always get too emotional." Emotional? The word hung between us like a verdict. I realized with painful clarity that in this conversation, I was no longer his mother. I was a problem to be solved. "Ethan," I said slowly, deliberately, "do you know why your father wanted to keep this land?" "Because of feelings," Ethan replied, impatience in his voice. "I get it. But feelings don't pay bills." "But feelings gave you the foundation to stand where you are," I said. "Without this land, without the people who protected it before you, you wouldn't have the life you have now." "That's the past," Ethan cut in. "You keep clinging to it. You need to be more realistic." I took a deep breath. For the first time since my husband died, since I pushed myself to raise my son alone, I felt something with absolute clarity. I was being pushed out of my own family story. "I'm not sending the paperwork," I said. There was dead silence on the other end. "What?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping. "I said no," I repeated. "This land is not for sale, not to be divided, not for you and your wife's family to profit from." Ethan's tone changed completely. No longer casual, no longer upbeat. It sharpened, tightened. "You don't have the right to be that selfish. I'm your son. This is my future, too." "You don't have the right to take something you don't respect," I replied. "So you're choosing the land over me?" Ethan almost shouted. The question hit me straight in the chest, but this time I didn't step back. "I'm choosing to keep my promise," I said, "and I'm choosing self-respect." Claire was right. Ethan snapped, his voice full of anger. "You've always been controlling. You always think you know what's best." I tightened my grip on the phone. "If controlling means not letting you destroy our family's legacy," I said, "then I accept that." The call ended in heavy silence. No goodbye, no farewell. I lowered my hand and stared at the screen as it went dark. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a truth that had just been laid bare. The conflict was no longer simmering. It had officially erupted. I stood there, between the house and the land I had protected my entire life. And for the first time, I understood that this fight was no longer just about property. It was about boundaries, about a mother who had sacrificed too much, finally standing up and saying no, even if the price was the very blood relationship she once believed nothing could ever break. The call ended, but its echo didn't fade. It hung in the house like a thin haze, seeping into every corner, making it impossible to pretend that everything would somehow settle on its own like before. I made lunch, that day in silence, ate a few bites out of obligation, then washed the dishes, my mind completely elsewhere. I knew it clearly. Ethan wasn't going to stop there. And I was right. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing. The first message came from Ethan. short, carrying the familiar tone he used whenever he wanted to soften me. "Mom, I'm sorry I lost my temper earlier. I'm just worried about you. Can we talk again?" I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message came in. "You don't understand. Everything I'm doing is for our family's future." Then a missed call. Then 2, then 3. I let the phone sit on the kitchen table, vibrating and going silent again, like a living thing trying to pull my attention. I thought about the times Ethan was little, crying for candy or toys, and how I learned that sometimes, if you didn't give in right away, the whining would pass. But this was no longer a child. This was a grown man, and what he wanted wasn't a toy. It was my entire life. By evening, the tone of the messages changed. "You're making everything worse. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn. Claire is really upset. Her family doesn't understand you at all." A deep exhaustion settled over me. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from a person who has spent a lifetime trying to please others, only to be condemned for finally stopping. The call came around 9 p.m. This time, I answered. "Judith," Ethan said, not calling me Mom, just my name. A small detail, but enough to tell me he had crossed into another territory. "You're backing me into a corner." "You backed yourself in," I replied, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "No," Ethan shot back. "You have all the power. You're holding the paperwork. You're holding the property. You're controlling everything. Controlling. That word again. That property isn't yours," I said. "At least not yet. But I'm your son," Ethan nearly shouted. "Who are you going to leave it to if not me?" The question wasn't curiosity. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in reason. I could hear his breathing on the other end, fast and shallow, as if he were trying to convince himself he was right. "Ethan," I said slowly, "I've already told you. I'm not selling the land." There was a heavy pause. Then his voice shifted completely, dropping lower, colder. "Then don't blame me," Ethan said, "if things go too far." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I'm just giving you a warning," he replied. "The law won't always be on your side. I have my rights." I ended the call. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. But something inside me closed. That was the moment I realized emotion was no longer our shared language. It had been replaced by strategy. The next day, Claire called. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. Part of me was curious what she would say. Another part of me was already familiar with that pleasant tone people use when they want something. "Judith," Claire said gently, almost warmly. "I just wanted to talk for a moment. Nothing tense." "Go ahead," I replied. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she continued. "Ethan and I respect you very much, truly. But you have to understand, we're building our own life." "Respect?" I repeated, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "When exactly did you show me that respect?" There was a very slight pause. Then Claire laughed softly, the sound carefully practiced. "You're being overly sensitive. That wedding day? It was just stress. I never meant to push you out." "But you did," I said, "and you never apologized." "I am apologizing now," Claire said quickly. "I just hope we can talk like adults, calmly, rationally." Rationally, a very convenient word often used to cover coldness. "What do you want?" I asked plainly. "I want you to look at the bigger picture," Claire said. "That land, it's too much for you. I'm worried about your health, really. You can't live out there alone forever." The words sounded painfully familiar, exactly what Ethan had said, as if they had sat together and rehearsed every argument, every sentence. And if you were truly worried about me, I said, you wouldn't have started your marriage by pushing your mother-in-law out of the wedding. Claire's voice stiffened slightly, but only for a moment. Judith, I think you're putting emotions over reason. You're acting selfishly. Selfish. The word was spoken lightly, like a feather, but it landed like a stone. I suddenly understood that in this story the roles had completely reversed. I, the one who had given everything, was now the selfish one. And they, the ones demanding, saw themselves as victims. You've said enough, I replied. There's nothing left to discuss. Judith. I hung up. In the days that followed, the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. Messages came constantly. Sometimes from Ethan, sometimes from Claire, sometimes from unknown numbers I guessed were relatives on Claire's side. The content circled the same points again and again. I was overreacting. I was controlling. I was ruining my son's future. Some nights I picked up my phone and reread the messages, wondering if I really was wrong. Was I clinging too tightly to a past that no longer fit? Was I making things difficult for my son because I was afraid of loss? But then I stepped outside, looked at the land stretching under the moonlight, and the answer became clear. I wasn't afraid of losing the land. I was afraid of losing myself. One morning, after waking up to more than a dozen missed calls, I did something I had never done before. I turned my phone off completely. No vibration, no notifications, no screen, lighting up. The house became strangely quiet, as if I could finally breathe. I made tea, sat on the back porch, and watched the wind ripple through the tall grass. For the first time in days, I didn't feel pulled in every direction by other people. In that quiet, I began to think, not about how to calm Ethan, but about what I wanted my future to look like. I had lived too long in the role of the one who sacrifices, the one who gives in, the one who steps back so others can move forward. But I wasn't young anymore. I didn't have time left to fix choices born out of fear. A very small, very faint thought began to take shape. I didn't name it. I didn't dare say it out loud, but it was there, like a seed planted in dry soil after the first rain. If they could make plans behind my back, then maybe I needed a plan of my own. I didn't know then how fast that seed would grow. I only knew that in the moment I chose silence and a temporary retreat, I wasn't running away. I was preparing. I kept my phone off for 2 full days, not to punish anyone, but because I needed to hear my own voice again. The familiar sounds of this land returned. The wind moving through the pines, the barn door creaking as the temperature shifted, my own footsteps on the worn path leading to the forest's edge. In that quiet, one thought grew clearer and clearer, no longer just a seed. If I did nothing, they would do it for me. Ethan and Claire weren't hiding their intentions anymore. They weren't speaking the language of emotion, but the language of plans, of profit, of what was reasonable. And what frightened me most wasn't that they wanted to sell the land. It was how they talked about it, as if this place were nothing more than an obstacle, a burden that needed to be removed so the road ahead could be clear. I had seen too many patients at the hospital lose control over their own lives simply because they were one step too slow. I had always believed that would never happen to me. But now, as my son began talking about rights and the law, I understood that I could no longer rely on motherhood to protect what mattered. On the 3rd morning, I turned my phone back on. The screen lit up almost instantly, showing dozens of missed calls and unread messages. I didn't open them. I searched for one name in my contacts, Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca was the lawyer who had helped me handle the paperwork when Marcus died. She didn't talk much, didn't circle around issues, and always looked straight at the problem. I hadn't seen her in years, but as I pressed the call button, I knew this was the call I needed to make. "Sloan Law Office," a woman's voice answered. "This is Judith Monroe," I said. "I need to see Rebecca as soon as possible." There was a brief pause. Then Rebecca's voice came on the line. "Judith, it's been a long time. Are you all right?" "I need to talk," I said, "about the land." Her tone turned serious. "Can you come to the office this afternoon?" I drove into town in the early afternoon. The familiar road past small shops, the old cafe, the post office where I used to take Ethan to mail letters to his grandparents when he was little. This town had witnessed every stage of my life, from a newly married young woman to a busy mother to a widow trying to stand her ground. And now I was coming back with a different kind of fear, heavier, because it came from my own blood. Rebecca's office was on the second floor of an old brick building. The wooden stairs creaked softly under my feet. When I stepped inside, I smelled paper, ink, and coffee. A very law office smell, very practical. Rebecca stood when she saw me, her brown hair streaked with gray pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. "You look tired." I gave a faint smile. "I probably am." I told her everything. I didn't leave out a single detail. The wedding, the words, "You should go home," the call the next morning, the messages, the accusations of selfishness and control. I even told her about the suggestion to move me into a senior living community as a solution for everyone. As I spoke, Rebecca didn't interrupt. She just listened, occasionally jotting down short notes. When I finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Rebecca set her pen down and leaned back. "What's your biggest fear?" she asked. I didn't have to think long. "That they'll destroy the land," I said. "That everything my family built will disappear. That one day I'll be standing there watching bulldozers flatten the place where my grandfather planted trees, where my husband once stood smiling with our son." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then we need to make sure that never happens." She pulled a folder from her drawer and flipped through a few pages. "You're still the sole legal owner of the land. Ethan has no legal rights to it, unless you transfer it or you pass away without clear arrangements." "I know," I said, "but I don't want everything to depend on unless." Rebecca studied me for a moment as if weighing something. Then she said, "There is a way." She began explaining about a conservation trust, a type of trust designed for land. The property would be placed into the trust with very specific conditions. It could not be sold, could not be divided, could not be commercially developed. Its sole purpose would be preservation, for nature, for the community, for future generations. "The most important thing," Rebecca said, slowing her voice so I would hear every word, "is that once you do this, it can't be undone. Once the land is in the trust, it no longer belongs to you personally. You won't be able to take it back or change your mind." I fell silent. The thought tightened my chest. This land had belonged to my family for so many years. The idea that it would no longer be in my name, even for protection, made me hesitate. "How will Ethan react?" I asked. Rebecca was blunt. "He won't be happy, and you need to be prepared for strong opposition." I looked down at my hands, fingers that had trembled while signing so many documents over a lifetime, but never like this. "If I don't do it," I said softly, "I'll live in fear forever." Rebecca nodded. "That's right. And you also need to understand, doing this isn't revenge. It's setting boundaries. Boundaries. The word echoed in my mind like a belated reminder. I had lived my whole life without clearly drawing boundaries with my son. I thought love meant leaving the door wide open. I was wrong. Without boundaries, love gets invaded. I sat there for a long time, weighing everything. Ethan as a little boy, his hand wrapped in mine as we crossed the street. Marcus standing on the land, telling me I had to protect it at all costs. And Claire's faint smile when I was pushed out of the wedding. "I need time," I said. Rebecca didn't press me. "Of course, but you should know that time is also a factor. The pressure from them won't ease." I stood up, took my bag, and prepared to leave. Before opening the door, I turned back to Rebecca. "If I decide to do it," I asked, "will you help me?" She smiled. Not a comforting smile, but a steady one. "That's my job." On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove slowly, letting each thought settle. When I turned onto the dirt road leading back to the house, I stopped the car, got out, and looked around at the familiar land. The afternoon light fell low, tinting the grass gold. A light breeze carried the scent of pine resin. I placed my hand on the trunk of the oldest oak tree and felt the rough bark beneath my fingers. "I'll protect you," I whispered, not knowing whether I was speaking to the tree, to Marcus, or to myself. In that moment, the hesitation inside me began to fade. I hadn't signed anything yet, but I had done something more important. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where my boundary was, and I was ready to defend it. I didn't return to the law office the very next day. I needed one more night, not to hesitate, but to be sure this decision wasn't born from anger or hurt. I had lived long enough to know the difference between a reaction and a choice. Reactions are impulsive. Choices have to stand even after emotions settle. That night, I slept very little. I didn't toss and turn, and I didn't dream. I just lay still, listening to the house breathe. The wind tapped softly against the window frame. Tree branches brushed the porch roof. Those familiar sounds had been the backdrop of my life for decades, and now they seemed to be witnessing me reach a crossroads no one else could walk for me. The next morning, I made coffee, drank it slowly, then got dressed. Not anything formal or elaborate, just the light brown jacket I usually wore when going into town, the shoes that had been with me for years. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving. That face had wrinkles and weariness, but no longer confusion. I nodded to myself like a quiet confirmation. When I walked into Rebecca Sloane's office for the second time that week, she looked at me and immediately knew I was ready. There was no long small talk. Rebecca pulled a thick folder from the drawer and set it on the desk. Crisp white pages, black printed text, dry legal language. But I knew that inside was the fate of the land, and also of my relationship with my son. "Before we begin," Rebecca said slowly, "you need to hear this one more time. When you sign, the land will be transferred into a conservation trust. It will no longer be personal property. It won't belong to you, to Ethan, or to any heir." "I understand," I said. "You won't be able to change this decision later," she continued, "even if you want to." "I understand," I repeated, and this time my voice didn't shake. Rebecca studied me for a few seconds, then nodded. She slid the pen toward me. I took it. The pen felt heavier than I expected, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. I looked at the printed line at the top of the page. Judith Monroe, grantor, the one who transfers, the one who gives authority, the one who ends one chapter and begins another. I signed. Blue ink appeared on the paper, familiar yet strange. I signed the first page, then the second, Each time I put the pen down, it felt like I was loosening invisible cords that had bound me for years. There was pain, yes, a dull ache like pulling a tooth that had been loose for a long time. But right after came a spreading sense of relief, slow and steady. Rebecca turned the page. I signed again. Long, detailed, dry clauses. No selling, no subdivision, no commercial development, no transfer, no exceptions, no conditions. The land would be protected forever, not by emotion, but by law. On one page, in the middle of the file, there was a short paragraph that made me stop. The property shall be removed from the grantor's estate and shall not be subject to inheritance. The property would be removed from the will. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. This was the moment I understood very clearly. With this signature, I wasn't just protecting the land, I was also ending every hope Ethan had ever held, even the ones he never spoke aloud. I was closing the door my son believed would always be open to him, no matter what he did. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I thought of Ethan as a boy, standing on this grass, holding a wooden stick like a sword, declaring that one day he would protect our home. I thought of Marcus, his voice low and weak in his final days, his hand in mine as he said, "Don't let anyone take it away." I thought of my grandfather, of my father, men, who didn't leave me much money, but left me a foundation no one had the right to destroy. I opened my eyes. "Keep signing," I told myself. I signed the remaining pages slowly but firmly, no rushing, no hesitation. When I signed the final page, Rebecca placed her hand on the folder as if to confirm it was done. "It's finished," she said. "From this moment on, the land belongs to the Conservation Trust. It's protected by law." I set the pen down. A brief emptiness passed through me, not from loss, but from something ending. And right after it came a peace I hadn't felt in a very long time. "What do I do next?" I asked. "Nothing," Rebecca replied. "The rest is on me, but you should prepare yourself." "I am prepared," I said. On the drive home, I went slower than usual. I didn't turn on the radio. I let my thoughts drift freely without grabbing onto them. I knew that when Ethan found out, his reaction would be fierce. I knew Claire wouldn't stay quiet. I knew accusations, threats, pleading, all of it would come. But I also knew something else. I was no longer standing on unstable ground. When the car turned onto the dirt road leading home, I stopped once again, as I had been doing these past days. I stepped out and stood in the land, bathed in late afternoon light. The wind moved through the tall grass. In the distance, the old wooden barn still stood, quiet and enduring. I placed a hand on my chest and felt my steady heartbeat. "I did the right thing," I whispered, needing no one else to hear. In that moment, I felt the change inside me clearly. I was no longer the woman waiting for her child's approval, no longer the mother afraid that a firm decision would make her lose everything. I still loved Ethan. That hadn't changed. But I was no longer willing to trade myself to preserve an image of family that no longer existed. I went inside, hung up my jacket, and made tea. Those small, familiar tasks suddenly felt steadier, as if everything had found its proper order again. I sat down in Marcus's armchair and looked out the window. The light faded outside, leaving a calm, deep blue. The storm hadn't arrived yet. I knew that. But when it did, I wouldn't be standing in the open anymore. I had signed. And that signature, irrevocable, was exactly what kept me standing. I knew that call would come. I just didn't know it would come so quickly. The phone rang while I was standing on the back porch, watering the wildflower bed Marcus had planted years ago. The day was slipping toward evening, the sunlight softening, a light breeze making the petals tremble. The scene was so peaceful it was almost cruel, because I knew very well this peace was about to be torn apart. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer right away. I turned off the hose, set it neatly aside, wiped my hands on my pants, and only then picked up the phone. Not because I wanted to prolong the tension, but because I wanted to be truly ready. "Mom," Ethan said the moment I answered. His voice was no longer normal, no longer angry, but breaking in a different way. Please tell me this is all a misunderstanding." I leaned against the porch post and looked out at the land sinking into the colors of dusk. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though we both knew the answer. "Rebecca Sloan just called me," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "She said you signed something, that the land doesn't belong to you anymore. Tell me, Mom, this isn't true, right?" I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice steady. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "I transferred the land into a conservation trust." On the other end of the line, silence crashed down, a thick silence so heavy I could hear my son's ragged breathing. "No," Ethan whispered. "No, you can't do that. You don't have the right." "It's my legal right," I replied, "and I did it." Ethan's voice broke completely. "Mom, you don't understand. You just destroyed everything, all our plans." "Plans you never once asked me about," I cut in, my voice still even. "Plans you thought you could carry out after throwing me out of your own wedding." I heard a strange sound in the background. Footsteps. A woman's voice, sharp and urgent. "Ethan, what's going on?" Claire's voice rang out, not quiet at all. "Who are you talking to?" "Mom," Ethan said quickly, as if afraid I'd disappear. "You have to fix this. I'm begging you. This is too big." "Put Claire on," I said. There was a brief hesitation. Then I heard the phone change hands. "Judith?" Claire spoke. Her voice was no longer gentle. It was sharp, tight, nearly shaking with anger. "I don't understand why you would do this." "You understand perfectly," I replied. "You just don't like it." "This is incredibly selfish," Claire said, each word heavy. "You're not thinking about Ethan. You're not thinking about our family." "I have thought about it," I said slowly. "I thought long and hard, and I chose to protect what my family built instead of letting it be destroyed for someone else's benefit." "Destroyed?" Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I call that development. I call that the future." "A future where I'm pushed aside," I said, "just like you did at the wedding." I heard a sharp breath on the other end. "Judith, you can't keep clinging to that," Claire said. "That's in the past." "It's in the past for you," I replied. "Not for me." Ethan grabbed the phone back. "Mom, I'm begging you," he said, his voice nearly collapsing. "You can change this decision. I know you can." "No," I said, just one word, clear. "I can't. I'll sue," Ethan blurted out. Immediately after, he seemed to regret it. I don't want to, but you're leaving me no choice." "You can try," I replied, "but you won't win." "I'm your son," Ethan almost shouted. "I have inheritance rights." "You don't have rights to something you don't respect," I said. "And Rebecca already explained that to you, that conservation trust is irreversible." On the other end, I heard Claire mutter a curse under her breath. "We'll find another lawyer," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "There has to be a way." I closed my eyes for a second. "You can ask as many lawyers as you want," I said when I opened them. "The truth doesn't change." "Mom," Ethan choked. "You're choosing the land over me." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the land stretching out in front of me, the rows of trees standing still in the fading light. I remembered the moment Ethan looked at me at the wedding, his eyes distant and hard. I remembered the feeling of being told to leave, like an unwelcome guest. "You already chose, Ethan," I said at last. "You chose when you said you should go home. You chose when you called this land abandoned. You chose when you treated me like an obstacle." "I didn't think you'd go this far," Ethan said, his voice shattered. "I didn't think you'd dare." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You didn't think about me at all. You just assumed I would always give in." There was a long silence. This time, no one spoke. I could hear Ethan breathing heavily, hear Claire whispering angrily somewhere in the background. I knew that in this moment, everything in my son's mind was collapsing, not just his plans, but his image of the mother he believed would never say no. "Mom," Ethan said very softly, like he used to when he was little, "I'm scared." I tightened my grip on the phone. My heart ached, but it didn't waver. "You're scared because you lost control," I said, "and I've lived in fear for too long." "So this is really it?" Ethan asked. "That depends on you," I replied, "but this land is settled." I heard a quiet sob, then Claire snapped sharply, "Ethan, stop begging, she's not worth it." That sentence, more than any threat, made everything brutally clear. "I've heard enough," I said. "We'll talk later if there's anything left to talk about." I ended the call. My hand trembled slightly, but not from regret. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch and watched the last light of day fade. In my chest was a deep sadness, the sadness of a mother realizing the child she raised no longer stood on her side. But at the same time, another feeling rose, a cold clarity. What I had just done wasn't the cause of this collapse. It was only the result. Cause and effect were taking shape, and I knew that from this moment on, none of us could return to the original starting line. Time began to move, differently after that call, no longer frantic, no longer suffocating. Days followed one another slowly, as if the land itself were deliberately pulling me back into its natural rhythm. Summer passed, leaving cooler mornings and shorter afternoons. I worked in the garden, repaired the fence on the west side, repainted the barn door. Small, repetitive tasks, but each time I finished one, I felt like I was laying another brick in my new piece. Ethan stopped calling. Not immediately. In the first few weeks, emails still came, forwarded from his lawyer, written in stiff language filled with familiar threatening phrases. Reconsider, dispute, legal rights. Rebecca handled all of it. She replied briefly, precisely, and left no opening. Whenever I asked, she simply said, "There's no progress, they have no case." Then the emails became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped. News about Claire reached me in a way I never expected, through a neighbor who stopped by to help fix a water pipe. He mentioned it casually, like small-town talk. Claire had moved out of the apartment the newlyweds had rented, just a few months after the wedding. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need to. Later, there was a short email from Rebecca with a simple note attached, "For your awareness." It was a notice of legal separation filed by Claire. No flowery language, no long explanations, just dry, cold text, exactly like the way she had looked at me on the wedding day. I sat in front of the screen for a long time, reading those few lines over and over, not because I was happy, not because I was sad. I just felt empty. The emptiness of someone who had seen what they knew all along, but still hoped it wouldn't happen. Ethan lost his marriage before it ever had a chance to become a family. And with it, he lost the illusion that everything in life could be traded for plans and pressure. The legal threats disappeared completely after the first lawsuit was dismissed. No grounds, no legal interest, nothing to hold on to. Rebecca told me the other lawyer had advised Ethan to stop because the longer it dragged on, the more money he would lose, and the worse it would look if there were ever any future disputes. "He's paying the price," Rebecca said during a call, "and not just financially." I knew what she meant. I heard that Ethan had to sell the new car he'd bought to pay off debts. I heard he moved into a smaller apartment. None of that came from me, and I didn't go looking for it. It arrived on its own, like the natural consequences of a chain of bad choices. As for me, life slowly became peaceful again, in a way I had forgotten was possible. I began attending community meetings connected to the Conservation Trust, not as someone in charge, but as a contributor. I listened to young people talk about environmental protection, about nature education. I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen in my son's eyes for years: respect. The land began to change in very small, very real ways. A path was cleared so children could visit safely. One corner of the meadow was left untouched so wildflowers could keep blooming with the seasons. No concrete, no tall fences, just small wooden signs that read, "Conservation Area. Please tread lightly." The first time a group of children came to visit, I watched from a distance. They laughed, ran around, pointed when birds lifted from the edge of the woods. A young teacher explained the old oak tree to them, how it had been standing longer than their grandparents had been alive. I saw a little boy place his hand on the trunk, exactly the way Ethan used to when he was small. I turned away, not because it hurt, but because I understood. Life keeps going, even when it doesn't follow the shape we once imagined. In the evenings, I sat on the porch, drank tea, and watched the sun set behind the trees. No more constant phone calls, no more accusations, just insects, wind, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I no longer lived in fear that someone would come take something from me tomorrow. Legacy, I realized, was never about money. It is the ability to say enough when greed starts to blur family ties. It is protecting values that can't be converted into profit. It is the courage to accept the loss of a relationship so you don't lose yourself. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan. Just one short line: "Mom, I'm sorry." No explanation, no request, no plan. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply right away. I needed time, and this time I knew I had the right to it. I looked out at the land bathing in the last light of day. The children were gone. Nature had returned to its own rhythm. Everything was quiet. The price of greed had been paid. And the true value of legacy, not something to seize, but something to protect, finally stood clear and undeniable. The letter arrived on a very ordinary morning. Not an email, not a text. A cream-colored paper envelope, slightly thick, placed neatly in the wooden mailbox by the gate. My name was handwritten on it in a familiar yet unfamiliar script, slanted slightly to the right, a bit shaky, as if the writer had paused many times before each word. I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. I knew immediately it was from Ethan. I didn't need to see a return address. I didn't need any other sign. Some things, no matter how much time passes, a mother recognizes by a faint feeling deep in her chest. I brought the letter inside and set it on the kitchen table. Made tea, sat down. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, laying a thin stripe of light across the envelope. It was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. I took a deep breath. Then I opened it. The paper inside was folded into thirds, not expensive stationery, just ordinary letter paper, slightly wrinkled at the corners as if it had been clenched and then smoothed out again. The first word tightened my chest. Mom. Just one word, but different from before. No demands, no blame, no pleading, just a raw, fragile address. Ethan wrote that he had lost many nights of sleep, that when everything collapsed, his marriage, his plans, the things he thought were certain, he finally began to look back at every step he had taken. He admitted that he had let others lead him, had let promises of an easy future blur the past. He wrote that Claire hadn't forced him with orders, but with carefully chosen words, that he believed it was maturity, a way of stepping out of his mother's shadow, that he hadn't realized that while trying to prove he was an independent man, he had betrayed the only person who had never turned her back on him. I read slowly, not skipping a single word. Ethan wrote about the wedding day, about the moment he saw me standing alone by the dessert table. He said he knew then that he was wrong, but he chose silence because he was afraid of upsetting his wife, afraid of damaging his image in front of others. He called it cowardice, his word, not mine. He wrote that when Claire left, he sat alone in the empty apartment and for the first time understood what it meant to be left behind. No one waiting for him to come home, no one asking if he had eaten, no one reminding him to wear an extra layer when it was cold. He wrote that in that moment he thought of me not as a controlling mother, but as a quiet presence he had always taken for granted. By then my hands were trembling. Ethan admitted that he had seen the land as an asset because he had never had to sweat to keep it. He wrote that he had confused the right to inherit with the right to take, that he hadn't understood that legacy is passed on with responsibility, not as an unconditional gift. Then came the part that made me stop. I've thought about everything over and over, and I realized something painful. The only person in my life who truly sacrificed, asked for nothing, never set conditions, was you. And you're the one I hurt the most. I folded the letter, not because I didn't want to keep reading, but because I couldn't. The tears came unexpectedly, not in a rush, not with sobs, just quiet drops falling onto the back of my hand, hot and heavy. It was the first time I had cried since the wedding, not from resentment, not from loss, but from something deeper, because at last my son had seen what I once feared he never would. I sat like that for a long time. The letter lay on the table. The tea had gone cold. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor. At the end of the letter, Ethan didn't ask for the land back. He didn't mention money. He didn't talk about plans. He only wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't expect forgiveness right away, that he only hoped that one day I might be able to look at him without pain. He signed his name, just his name, nothing else. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it into the desk drawer where I keep important papers, not to lock it away, but to let it be there, present, but not demanding. I wasn't ready to forgive, not because I didn't want to, but because forgiveness isn't a door that swings open just because an apology arrives at the right time. It's a long road, and I had gone too far down the path of protecting myself to return to the starting line immediately. That afternoon, I walked the land, a light breeze, clear sky. I stood beneath the old oak and placed my hand on its trunk, as I had done so many times before. I thought of Ethan as a child, of Marcus, of all the versions of myself who had passed through this place. I didn't know what the future would hold. Maybe one day I would answer the letter. Maybe I would invite Ethan here, not as an heir, but as a son. if he was patient enough to learn how to stand beside me again instead of across from me. Or maybe we would keep our distance, a distance not born of hatred but of healing. I didn't rush to decide. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself not to be the one who fixed everything right away. I allowed the future to remain open, not shaped by anyone else's wishes, but by a rhythm I could live with. The letter rested quietly in the drawer, and I, at last, allowed myself to breathe more slowly. My life after that wasn't dramatic, the way people often imagine when a family breaks apart like that. It was quiet, steady, and stronger than I ever expected. I woke each morning with sunlight filling the room. I made coffee, opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and took a deep breath of grass and damp earth. The land was still there, unchanged, needing no explanation. The oak still stood, the path still guided my steps along familiar rhythms. No one came to take anything away. No machines, no billboards, just the quiet continuation of nature and memory. I grew used to this peace, not the peace that comes when every relationship is perfect, but the peace that comes when you stop betraying yourself to hold on to things that are no longer love. I no longer jumped every time the phone rang. I no longer lived in fear that one firm decision would cost me everything. I had lost something, but I had kept something more important. The land now belongs to the Conservation Trust. Children come to learn about nature. Young people plant more trees, repair the paths, place small wooden signs that tell the history of this place. I am not the center of it all, and I don't need to be. I am simply part of the flow, just as my grandfather was, just as my father was, just as Marcus was. I came to understand that true legacy isn't about how much money you leave behind or who gets called an heir. Legacy is about what you choose to protect when you have the power to choose. It's about the values you refuse to sell, even when the price offered is tempting. And sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what you give your children, but the lesson you force them to learn, even if it comes late. I still love Ethan. That didn't disappear just because he hurt me, but I no longer confuse love with unconditional sacrifice. I once believed that being a mother meant yielding until the end, staying silent to keep the peace, enduring so your child could be comfortable. I was wrong. Love does not mean letting others trample your boundaries, and protecting yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the most honest form of love toward yourself and toward others. Some afternoons I sit beneath the old oak and watch sunlight filter through the leaves. I think about everyone who has passed through my life, the choices that brought me here. I no longer ask, what if? I don't wish to go back to any moment to change it. I walked my path, slow, painful, but right. If there is one thing I want to say to anyone listening to this story, it is this. You are not too old to set boundaries. You are not too late to choose yourself again, and you do not owe anyone a sacrifice that costs you your own worth. My life now is not grand, but it is real. It stands firm, and it belongs to me. If you're listening to this story, I would love to know, where are you watching from? From which city, or from what quiet corner of the world? Was there something in this story that felt like it was about you? If you were in my place, what would you do? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every line with gratitude. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening to my story with patience and empathy. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so we can continue listening together to more stories. about family, about boundaries, and about values that cannot be sold. I know that somewhere out there are people who are also learning how to stand upright again. And if this story helps you feel a little steadier, then everything I went through truly meant something. Don't sign anything. If you still want to see the kids. I was standing in the kitchen, my hand lightly shaking as I held the phone, listening to my daughter's voice, the daughter who had disappeared from my life more than 15 years ago. Say those words as if I were a stranger. That sentence didn't just stop me in my tracks. It forced me to face a question I had avoided for half my life, whether what I had been doing for the past 16 years was truly protection or just holding on. Families sometimes don't fall apart because of great evils, but because of small things left unattended for too long. I used to believe that as long as I stayed, as long as I didn't leave like others did, everything would somehow be okay. But if even staying can cause harm, then where is the line? I asked myself that question right there in my old kitchen, where the smell of morning coffee still lingered in the air. And then I understood. This didn't start with today's phone call. It started in a winter long ago, when I had just turned 51. If you're listening to this story from some city out there, leave me a comment and let me know. And if you've ever witnessed or lived through fragile boundaries in a family, tap like so this story can reach more people. I also want to be clear about something from the very beginning, before going any further. The story I'm telling isn't meant to confirm any objective truth, and it certainly isn't meant to judge right or wrong. It's been pieced together and edited from life experiences, looked back on through my own memories and personal feelings. Memory, as you know, isn't always perfect. I'm telling this to reflect, not to judge, and definitely not to encourage anyone to follow any of the choices in this story. That year, I had been retired for a few months. My name is Maggie Holloway, a widow living in a small Midwestern town where winters are long and so quiet you can almost hear the snow settling on the windowsill. My husband died young from a stroke. My children were grown, each living their own lives somewhere else. The two-bedroom house suddenly felt far too large for one person. In those first months of retirement, I tried to fill my days with small routines. Waking early to make coffee, walking around the neighborhood, reading the print newspaper like I had done for 30 years while working. If I had to describe my life back then in one word, it would be calm. Until one December afternoon when Laura appeared at my front door. She didn't knock hard or urgently. When I opened the door, Laura stood there with two children, a boy and a girl bundled in thick scarves. She looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion you see in someone who's traveled a very long way without rest. "Mom," Laura said, her voice quick and low. "I just need you to help me for a little while. Just a few weeks. I need to get myself together." I didn't ask, get together what? And I didn't ask how long a few weeks really meant. I simply opened the door wider, a reflex left over from when she was still a child. The two kids stepped inside, their shoes covered in snow, their hands gripping each other tightly. They didn't cry or speak, just looked around my living room as if trying to memorize a strange place. Laura set a small duffel bag beside the couch and handed me a set of keys. "I'll call," she said. "I promise I'll call." No paperwork, no agreement, no clear promise beyond a few weeks. Just the cold keys in my hand and a vague unease creeping up my spine. But I didn't stop Laura. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't even hold her for as long as a mother probably should. I just stood there watching her turn and walk back into the snow, telling myself she'd be back soon. In those first days, I lived in a state of waiting. I left Laura's bedroom untouched, afraid to disturb anything. I kept my phone close at all times, even when I was in the kitchen or out in the yard. The children stayed, quiet in a way that was almost unsettling. The older boy, Ethan, I remembered, tried hard to act strong. The younger one, Lily, startled awake from her sleep. I comforted them, cooked simple meals, told old stories I'd forgotten I even knew. A few weeks passed quickly. Then Christmas came. Laura called once, said things were not ready yet, and asked me to give her more time. I said okay, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. I hung 2 extra stockings by the fireplace and wrote the kids' names on them in red marker, as if they had always belonged there. Winter dragged on. Snow melted, then fell again. The kids started school near my house. My name appeared on school forms, first as grandmother, then simply as guardian. I signed without thinking much, knowing someone had to. Laura called less and less. Every call came with a different explanation, but always the same ending. I'm not ready yet. I began adjusting my life without noticing. I stopped taking long morning walks because I had to make breakfast. I no longer finished the newspaper because I was interrupted by small questions. I stopped long phone calls with old friends because evenings were for homework. It all happened so naturally, like slipping back into a role I once knew well. Some nights when the house was quiet, I sat alone in the living room and wondered if I was doing the right thing. I wasn't angry at Laura. I didn't see myself as a martyr. I just felt a low, steady worry, like standing on a bridge without seeing either end. But then morning came. Ethan and Lily woke up, and those questions were pushed aside. Late one evening, while searching for spare batteries in Laura's old drawer, my hand touched something cold and solid. It was Laura's old phone, the kind no one uses anymore. The screen was dark, but when I pressed the button, a notification appeared. A draft message. Never sent. I stood there a long time, the phone in my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt that maybe I had missed something more important than simply staying. I put Laura's old phone back in the drawer, closing it very gently, as if even the smallest sound might shatter something fragile inside me. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the unsent message, but because I realized I had stopped waiting for a specific timeline. A few weeks had become a blurry idea, drifting somewhere between rushed breakfasts and exhausted evenings. My retirement income wasn't much. After paying the mortgage, utilities, and insurance, there was just enough left for one person living carefully. With 2 kids, I had to recalculate everything. I learned to shop seasonally, switch familiar brands for cheaper ones, cut back on small social outings I once enjoyed. I didn't feel like I was sacrificing. I was just managing, like any adult does when life quietly places another responsibility in their hands. My mornings started earlier. I woke Ethan and Lily, helped them into coats and scarves, and walked them to the bus stop in the biting cold. Some days, I watched the bus disappear down the snowy road and wondered where Laura was at that moment. But that question usually faded quickly, replaced by the mental list of things to do. Buy cold medicine for Lily, apply for reduced school fees, call the clinic. At school, I grew used to the curious looks. At my first parent meeting, I sat slightly off to the side as if I were only temporary. The teacher smiled kindly and called my name, but the line where the kid's mother's name should have been remained blank. I didn't correct it. I didn't explain. I just answered questions about grades, health, and the things that were immediate and concrete. At the clinic, the nurse called my name when it was our turn. Relationship to the patient? She asked, still typing. Grandmother, I answered. After a while, the question disappeared. My name was automatically listed as the primary contact. I signed consent forms without my hands shaking like they had the first time. Everything changed gradually, without a single moment big enough to mark the shift. Midway through that school year, during a short after-hours meeting, Ethan's teacher looked at me, tilted her head slightly, and asked casually, "Where's their mother?" The question wasn't sharp or intrusive. It came out of habit. I was quiet for a few seconds, feeling my heartbeat slow. Then I said, evenly, "I'm here." The room paused for a brief moment, long enough for me to realize that the answer was both true and not entirely. Driving home that day, I thought a lot. I had never intended to take Laura's place. I never thought of myself as the kid's mother in the biological sense. but I couldn't deny that I had begun filling the space she left behind. And with that came a new worry. Was my presence quietly becoming an irreversible replacement? Children, I realized, don't ask who gave birth to them. They ask who stays when they need someone. I believed that. Believed presence mattered more than titles. But I also began to wonder, if Laura came back one day, what would my place in Ethan and Lily's lives be? And more importantly, was I doing something that made that return harder? Laura sent money sometimes, not regularly, not much, never with an address or explanation. Sometimes it was enough to cover groceries for a week, sometimes just a few dozen dollars, like a reminder that she still remembered. I didn't ask questions. I didn't save envelopes or receipts as proof. I treated it as something private between Laura and me, not something to measure or balance. Some people suggested I contact family services to make things official. I listened, but chose silence. Not because I feared complications, but because I wasn't ready to name what was happening. Once you name something, you have to face its consequences. And at that time, I just wanted everything to keep moving, even if I didn't know where it was going. Time passed quietly. A few weeks turned into a few years without me noticing where the boundary had been crossed. I stayed in the same house, made coffee every morning, stood at the bus stop in winter cold. But deep inside, I began to understand that I had crossed an invisible line, not with one big decision, but with hundreds of small ones, each reasonable in its moment. That's when I realized some boundaries aren't marked by signs or paperwork. They only appear once you've gone too far to turn back. I didn't tell anyone I was tired, not because I wasn't, but because I didn't know how to say it properly. In a small town like this, people know each other through quick greetings on porches, polite questions at the post office or grocery store. "How are you, Maggie?" I always nodded, smiled, said things were fine, and in some ways, that wasn't entirely a lie. I still woke up each morning, cooked dinner, took the kids to school, but some afternoons, when I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight settle clearly on my shoulders. I hid that exhaustion out of habit. I didn't complain to neighbors or call old friends to vent. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would become something too big to ignore, and I wasn't ready for that. I just wanted to keep everything manageable, even though deep down I knew I was unsteady. At home, life slowed into a new rhythm. Ethan and Lily grew used to it. They knew where to leave their shoes, when to turn off the TV, which evenings I liked to read in my armchair. One night, while I was washing dishes, Lily ran into the kitchen, wrapped her arms around my legs from behind, and whispered, "Mom." I turned quickly, my heart pounding. I corrected her right away, almost by reflex. "Call me Grandma, sweetheart." Lily looked up, a little confused, then nodded and ran off like nothing had happened. But later, I stopped correcting them. Sometimes Ethan called me Mom when he needed help with homework. Sometimes Lily said it in the middle of the night after a nightmare. I heard it. I knew it. And I stayed silent. I told myself it was just a habit, that it didn't mean anything deeper. But each time, a feeling rose in me that was hard to name, warm and heavy at the same time. One evening, sitting alone in the living room after the kids were asleep, I blamed myself for not correcting it again. I wondered if my silence was a kind of quiet consent. I loved them, that I couldn't deny. But I was also afraid. Afraid I was going too far. Afraid that one day Laura would return and find something had changed beyond repair. And in that fear, there was guilt. Guilt because I knew I wasn't entirely innocent in this closeness. Laura still called, but rarely. The calls were short, her voice tired, as if she were speaking while doing something else. She asked about the kids' health, a few general questions about school. I answered just enough. When I waited for words like, "I'm coming back soon," or "I'm trying to arrange things," she always changed the subject or ended the call with a rushed excuse. I didn't push. I didn't ask about money or dates. I didn't want to be pressure, and I didn't want to hear promises she might not even believe herself. Sometimes, after hanging up, I stared at the phone for a long time, wondering if my silence was another form of avoidance. Then I reminded myself that everyone moves at their own pace, and some questions asked too early only make things messier. I started writing in an old notebook with a worn cover, bought from a discount store. I didn't write every day. Sometimes weeks passed without a word, sometimes just a few lines before bed. I didn't write to accuse anyone or catalog Laura's absences. I wrote to understand myself, to name feelings I didn't have time to face during the day. In those pages, I admitted to myself that I loved Ethan and Lily deeply, but with fear woven through that love. I wrote about small moments that made me feel more like a mother than a grandmother, and I wrote about the quiet worry that, if I wasn't careful, that love could turn into a kind of replacement I never consciously chose. Some nights, when the wind rattled the windows and the house made the familiar sounds of age, I sat on my bed with the notebook on my lap and wondered whether I was doing the right thing, or just the easiest thing. I didn't have a clear answer. I only knew that the next morning I would wake up early, make breakfast, and see the kids out the door. And in that routine, I slowly realized there were things I didn't tell anyone, not because they weren't important, but because I wasn't brave enough to face them yet. Everything shifted on a morning that seemed ordinary. I was folding laundry when the phone rang. It was the school. The secretary's voice was a little rushed, trying to stay calm but clearly worried. Ethan had slipped during recess and scraped his knee. It wasn't serious, but he needed to be checked in the nurse's office. I dropped the clothes, grabbed my coat, and drove over, repeating one simple thought. It's just a small thing. At school, Ethan sat on the exam table, paler than usual, but smiling when he saw me. Lily stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. I bent down, checked the scrape, feeling both relieved and tense. The nurse handed me a stack of forms and said she needed my signature to authorize an X-ray, just in case. I took the pen, skimmed the familiar lines, then stopped at a blank space at the bottom. "Who are you on the record?" the nurse asked gently, clearly. The question froze me. I looked at the paper, then at her waiting face. In that brief moment, all the years collapsed into a single point. Grandmother, temporary caregiver, or simply the one who was there. I opened my mouth, ready to answer like always, but the words caught. I thought of Laura, not being there. I thought of Ethan, wincing in pain. "I'm the responsible one," I said, my voice low and slow, as if weighing each word. The nurse nodded and didn't ask anything else. She turned away to process the paperwork, leaving me with the pen and a strange sensation spreading through my body. I signed my name on the final line, my hand slightly shaking, the ink uneven. It was the first time I'd said those words out loud, and I knew, even if no one else heard, it had changed something. We went home that afternoon after the doctor confirmed it was only a minor injury. Ethan's knee was carefully bandaged. Lily was given a small candy to calm her. On the drive back, I drove slower than usual, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing. At home, I helped Ethan into bed and made Lily a warm glass of milk. When everything settled, I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned against the sink. My hands were trembling. Not violently, but enough for me to realize I wasn't as composed as I'd been at school. I looked at myself in the mirror, more gray in my hair than I remembered, tired eyes still trying to look steady. I wondered when I had become ready to say, "I'm responsible," in my daughter's place, and whether it was a step I'd never be able to undo. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room with only the soft yellow light of a table lamp. I opened the drawer where I kept Laura's old papers, originally looking for health insurance information. My hand brushed against a thin stack I hadn't touched in years. Among old bills and junk mail was a set of printed pages, the corners yellowed. It was an email, not one I'd received, but a printed draft with an unfinished subject line. I recognized Laura's writing immediately, short, broken sentences, as if she'd been thinking while typing. The message stopped midway, no greeting, no signature. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed, about being afraid she wasn't good enough to come back, about believing the kids would be better off staying with me. Then it ended abruptly, as if she'd deleted the urge to hit send. I held the pages for a long time without reading them all, just staring at the opening lines. In the quiet room, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know when Laura had written that email or why she'd printed it and left it behind. I only knew that maybe all these years I'd been seeing everything from too narrow an angle. I folded the paper, set it on the table, and sat there in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, making that familiar winter sound. I realized that what I said that morning at school wasn't just a temporary answer. It was a sign that I had reached a crossroads I'd never prepared for. And in my hands right now was an old piece of Laura, never sent, but enough to make me understand this story was far more complicated than simply who stayed and who left. I read that email slowly, one line at a time, as if the words might disappear if I went too fast. Laura didn't write anything specific about dates or plans. There was no, "I'll be back in the spring," and there was no, "I need 6 more months." Just short, scattered sentences about exhaustion. She wrote that every morning she woke up feeling out of breath, that the thought of coming back made her hands shake so badly she couldn't even type, that she was afraid of my eyes, afraid of the neighbors' questions, afraid of having to explain why she hadn't been able to do what everyone thought was obvious. The email stopped there, with no closing, like a breath cut off mid-inhale. I folded the paper and opened it again, trying to find some sign of calculation or selfishness, but there wasn't any. Only an exhaustion spreading through everything, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't need a clear reason. And in that moment, I realized what I hadn't dared to think for years. Laura hadn't disappeared from our lives. She was hiding from herself, hiding from expectations that maybe even I had accidentally put on her shoulders. Realizing that didn't make me feel lighter right away. It made everything more complicated. Because if Laura wasn't someone who left cleanly and for good, then I had stayed with those 2 children in a murky gap, one where no one was completely right and no one was completely wrong. I sat with that email in my hands for a long time, watching the lamplight fall across the old wooden table, and I wondered how much of my daughter I had truly understood through all the years of being her mother. Some people leave not out of malice, but because they can't stand themselves. That thought came to me gently, not dramatic, but enough to make me stop. I wondered whether forgiveness needs an apology, or if sometimes forgiveness is simply accepting that the other person didn't have enough strength to stay, even if they wanted to. I also understood that my memory, like any memory, may have been worn down and rearranged by personal feeling. The story I was telling myself wasn't the full truth for everyone involved. I couldn't, and didn't want to, assign motives to Laura. I only knew how it felt to me, how I looked back at scattered pieces through the lens of someone who has lived long enough to know that things are rarely just one-sided. After that night, I didn't change my life suddenly. I still woke up early, still made breakfast, still took Ethan and Lily to school, but a new question began forming in my mind. Where is my boundary? Not the boundary between me and Laura, but the boundary between caring and replacing. I loved those 2 children, and I had no intention of leaving them, but I also didn't want to erase their mother's place by accident, even if that place was empty and fragile. I started thinking about more practical things I had deliberately avoided before, not by looking for a lawyer or filing paperwork, but by trying to understand what I could do to protect the kids while not slamming Laura's door shut. Those thoughts made me tired, but it was a different kind of tired, like sore muscles after you've pushed them too long. Instead of turning to legal processes, I went to a counselor in the next town over. She was a few years older than me, her voice low and unhurried, not quick to offer advice. I told her, not everything, but enough for her to understand the situation. I told her about the unsent email, about the guilt of being called mom, about the fear that one day everything would collapse because I'd been standing in the wrong place. She listened, nodded, and asked me just one question. What do you want to protect most? That question stayed with me the entire drive home. I realized I didn't only want to protect the kids from instability. I also wanted to protect myself from becoming someone I never intended to become. And somewhere deep down, I also wanted to protect Laura from the feeling that she had lost everything just because she wasn't strong enough at the right moment. I put the email back in the drawer, but I no longer saw it as a heavy secret. It became a reminder that this story wasn't as simple as I once believed. I kept raising the kids, but I started paying closer attention to small signs, to questions I needed to answer more honestly, even when the answers weren't clear yet. Outside the window, winter slowly gave way to longer days. The snow melted, revealing damp ground and the first tiny buds. I knew I was entering a different stage, one where I couldn't rely only on routine and silence, but at least this time, I didn't feel like I was walking in complete darkness. Time never warns you before it decides to speed up. One day, I realized Ethan was nearly half a head taller than me, his voice noticeably deeper whenever he called down from upstairs. Lily no longer trotted along behind me. She started closing her bedroom door and playing music loud enough for me to hear, but not understand. Their teen years arrived quietly, without any single moment marking the change. It came in small shifts that added up into a distance I had to learn to accept. They knew I wasn't their biological mother. I never lied about that. From the beginning, I called Laura their mother, even as that name grew faint in everyday conversations. As he got older, Ethan started asking more, not in accusation, but with the curiosity of a child trying to piece his life together. I answered what I knew, without embellishing, without guessing. Lily listened more than she asked. Sometimes her eyes rested on me for a long time, as if weighing something she wasn't ready to say. One evening after dinner, Ethan stayed in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He leaned against the counter, quiet for a moment, then said slowly, "You didn't give birth to me, but you never left me." He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't dramatic. It sounded like a conclusion he'd been thinking about for a long time. I stood with my back to him, my hands still in warm water, feeling my chest tighten. I didn't turn around, and I didn't answer. I just kept washing the last plate, dried my hands, and pulled out a pan to make dinner like I did every day. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid my voice would shake if I spoke. Some sentences once said, "Stay with you for a long time." I needed time to place it where it belonged in my heart, instead of reacting immediately. Ethan didn't repeat it. He went upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the smell of onions and hot oil gently sizzling on the stove. Laura was completely silent during those years. No calls, no texts, no money sent. That silence was different from earlier gaps. It was thicker, more sealed, like a door closed carefully and fully. I didn't know where she was or how she was living. Sometimes I thought about trying to find out, asking someone to check. But I stopped myself. I had learned that some doors, if you knock too hard, only hurt both sides. I started thinking more about Ethan and Lily's future, not the specific kind, what school, what career, but their emotional future. I wondered what would happen when I no longer had the strength to be here every day. I didn't start legal paperwork or draw up documents. I just prepared myself, and I prepared them in the ways I knew. I taught Ethan how to manage allowance money, not through long lectures, but by letting him make small mistakes. I taught Lily how to cook a few simple meals, not because she would have to fend for herself soon, but because I wanted her to know she could. I talked to them about leaving home, about the mix of excitement and fear when you step into the world. I didn't say I would always be here. I only said that wherever they went, they would always have the right to come back, even if one day I wasn't in this house anymore. On quiet evenings, when the kids were in their own corners with their own worlds, I sat in the living room reading or knitting. I thought of Laura, not with anger anymore, not with blame, but with a sadness that had softened. I wondered whether she knew how much her children had grown, what they had said, who they were becoming. But I didn't write a letter or leave a message. I didn't want to disturb a silence that Laura might need just to keep going. Sometimes, rarely, I felt like I was standing between two shores. On one side was the responsibility I'd carried for years. On the other was the truth that I couldn't keep everything intact forever. I reminded myself that everything would have to change, whether I was ready or not. Change isn't always loss. Sometimes it's simply a different shape of continuing. Late one night, I turned off the kitchen light and stood there, looking at the house in the dark. I could see the marks of time, scuffs on the walls, a chair with a loose screw, an entry rug worn thin. I could also see what couldn't be seen, attachment, words that were never answered, roles that shifted without anyone declaring them. I knew I couldn't control the future, and I couldn't fix the past. The only thing I could do was be here one more day, with a clearer awareness of my own boundaries. And with that awareness, I began to accept that what I'd called stability all those years was really just a pause before everything moved into another stage. I didn't know what that stage would look like. I only knew that when it came, I wouldn't be as shocked as before. The call came late in the afternoon while I was folding a blanket on the sofa. The last sunlight angled through the window, making dust float visibly in the air. The number on the screen wasn't saved, an unfamiliar string of digits that made me hesitate for a couple of beats before picking up. I had gotten so used to expecting nothing from this phone that the ringing sounded like it belonged to someone else's life. "Hello?" I said, my voice so normal it surprised even me. On the other end, there was a brief silence. Then Laura's voice came through. Not loud, not shaky, not like the Laura from 16 years ago. It was lower, slower, as if it had passed through many layers of exhaustion. "Mom, it's me." 2 words, but enough to make me grip the edge of the table. She didn't apologize. She didn't say she had been wrong. She didn't complain or blame anyone. She only said she wanted to talk. That word choice threw me. Talk about what, after all those years of silence? I didn't ask right away. I let Laura continue. Let the rhythm of the call find its footing. "I think it's time. I should talk to you," Laura said, like she was reading a sentence she'd rehearsed many times. I could hear a familiar hesitation in her voice, the same hesitation I used to hear when she was about to say something hard. Then, without warning, Laura said something that tightened my chest. "You've done more than your part, Mom." It wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply a statement laid down gently, but it felt heavy as stone. I didn't react right away. I looked out the window at the grass turning pale yellow and felt my deepest fear being touched. For years, I had asked myself whether I was doing too much, whether my steady presence had accidentally pushed Laura farther away. Hearing her say it herself, even as just one sentence, knocked me off balance for a moment. But at the same time, I realized her voice didn't carry resentment. It sounded like someone trying to set a boundary without being sure where that boundary truly was. Laura kept talking, a little faster now, as if afraid I would cut her off. She said she wasn't calling to take the kids, not calling for money, not calling to change what existed. "I just want to connect," she said. The word connect sounded strange, almost like it didn't belong to us. I wondered if she even knew what she was asking for, or if she was reaching for a safe word to cover something unsteady. I listened, but my thoughts tangled. I had gotten used to having a clear villain to face. Absence, silence, years without explanation. But now, there was no obvious bad person. No one for me to be angry at. No one for me to condemn. Just a daughter who had grown up in ways I hadn't witnessed, standing on the other end of the call, trying to open a door she herself had closed long ago. Laura didn't say much about Ethan and Lily. She asked briefly, like she was afraid to go too deep. I answered just enough. No more, no less, no boasting, no hiding. I realized I was keeping distance, not because I was angry, but because I needed to understand where I stood in this story. There was a long silence between us. I could hear Laura's breathing, steady but heavy. I knew she was waiting for me to say something, maybe reassurance, maybe pushback, but I couldn't answer right away. Not because I had nothing to say, but because any answer might send everything down a path I wasn't ready to accept. "You don't have to answer me right now," Laura said, her voice softer. "I just wanted you to know." The words made my throat go dry. I nodded by reflex, then realized she couldn't see it. "I heard you," I said slowly. That was all I could say in that moment, and I knew it was true. Before hanging up, Laura took a deep breath. "If you're okay with it," she said, "we could meet in person." The last two words were barely spoken, as if she was afraid they would disappear if she said them out loud. I didn't answer immediately. I looked around the familiar room where every object belonged to a life Laura no longer fit into. I could feel hesitation pulling me in two directions. "Let me think about it," I said at last. Not a no, not a yes. Laura was quiet for a second, then said she understood. The call ended gently. No sigh, no promises. I set the phone down, my hands still a little shaky. The house was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking, steady and emotionless. I knew that from this moment, everything had started moving in a different way. And even though I hadn't answered, Laura's request to meet in person hung in the air like a question with no period. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near the highway, a place where people stopped more than they stayed. I arrived 10 minutes early, chose a table by the window, and ordered a hot tea, even though it wasn't cold outside. When Laura walked in, I recognized her immediately, but it still took a beat to match the face in front of me with my old memories. She looked tired. Not so thin it was alarming, not like someone freshly broken by tragedy. Just tired. The tiredness of someone who's been walking too long without ever stopping long enough to rest. She looked around, saw me, and paused. We both stood up almost at the same time, but we didn't hug. Just a small nod, like two people who have known each other a long time, but aren't sure whether to be close or distant. Laura sat down, slid her purse under the chair, and wrapped both hands around the cup of coffee she'd just ordered. I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, as if she was trying to keep herself steady. We started with simple opening lines. The weather, the drive, when this place had changed owners. No one mentioned 16 years right away, and I knew it wasn't avoidance so much as two people unsure how to enter a big story through a small door. Laura was the one who broke the silence. "I never thought you'd stay that long." She said it plainly, without accusation or dramatic surprise. But it felt like someone gently tapped on a door that had been shut tight inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't confirm. I just looked at her and realized there was both acknowledgement and helplessness in that sentence. In that moment, I understood that neither of us had been prepared for this. Laura hadn't been prepared to leave the kids for so long. I hadn't been prepared to be the one who stayed for that long. We had stepped into a wordless agreement, each carrying our own assumptions, and then we let time do what it does. Laura described the years in an even voice, jobs changing constantly, temporary places to live, relationships that came and went, nothing big enough to make me gasp. Nothing tragic enough to explain everything, just a chain of days, one after another, not exactly failure, not exactly success either. I listened without interrupting, without trying to force cause and effect into order. When it was my turn, I did the same. I talked about Ethan and Lily, but not too much. I talked about them growing up, about ordinary changes. I didn't mention sleepless nights or the times I blamed myself, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want this meeting to become a balance sheet of merit and fault. There was a moment when Laura stopped and looked straight at me, her eyes not turning away. Suddenly, I realized she was waiting for something decisive. Maybe forgiveness, maybe a late-coming accusation. But I didn't give her either. I just sat there, feeling my daughter's presence after all those years, and let that feeling find its own place. Staying is a choice, not an instinct. That thought became very clear in me. I had chosen to stay, day after day, not because I couldn't leave, but because on each of those days, staying made the most sense. But if someone comes back late, what rights do they still have? The right to be called mom? The right to step into the lives of children who grew up without them? I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure an answer even existed. We didn't make any agreement. We didn't promise anything about the future. There were no tears. Laura didn't apologize, and I didn't demand one. Maybe because we both understood that some apologies, when they come too late, only make everything heavier. We ended the meeting with a light handshake, like two people who had said enough for today. On the way home, I drove slower than usual. The familiar road stretched ahead, but I felt like I was moving through it in a different state. Not relief, not pain, just emptiness, like a room had been cleared out, but nothing had been put back yet. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I paused at the threshold. The house was quiet, smelling of old wood and familiar soap. I realized that meeting hadn't closed anything, but it had opened a new space inside me. A space with no noise, no climax, only the truth that this story had moved into another chapter. And even though I didn't know where that chapter would lead, I knew I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. I didn't tell Ethan and Lily right after the meeting. I needed a few days for my feelings to settle, to make sure that when I opened my mouth, I wasn't speaking from my own confusion. One evening, after dinner, when the dishes were put away and the kitchen had returned to its familiar quiet, I asked them to sit down at the table. Not with a serious tone, and not like I was preparing some big announcement. I just said I wanted to talk, and they nodded, each in their own way. I told them about meeting their mother. No embellishing, no softening, no exaggerating. I said that Laura wanted to reconnect, that she hadn't made any demands, and that everything was still open. I stopped there and let the words find their own way. I didn't tell them what they should do. I didn't suggest any path is right. I only said this was their story, and they had the right to feel it in their own way. Ethan reacted first. He stayed quiet for a long time, staring down at the tabletop, his fingers lightly tapping the wood edge like he was counting time. Then he looked up and asked a blunt question. "What do you want us to do?" That question, even though it was short, held all the hesitation of someone standing at a crossroads. I looked him straight in the eye and answered slowly, making sure I wasn't accidentally steering him. "I don't need to be chosen," I said. "I just need you to be yourselves." The words hung in the quiet kitchen. No raised voice, no martyrdom in them. It was simply the truth it had taken me years to name. Lily was different. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at me, then at her brother, then out the window as if she were searching for something to hold on to. Finally, Lily asked softly, "If we want to see Mom, will you be sad?" The question touched a very tender place in me. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I needed to be sure my answer wouldn't put more weight on her shoulders. "I might be sad," I said honestly, "but that's my feeling, not your responsibility." I watched Lily exhale in relief, as if she'd just been allowed to admit something she'd been carrying for a long time. In the days that followed, their reactions stayed different. Ethan grew quieter, spending more time in his room, listening to music and thinking. Lily asked more, small questions that went straight to the core, what their mother liked, what she used to be like, why things had turned out this way. I answered as best I could, always stopping at the boundary of guessing. I didn't want to speak for Laura, and I didn't want to paint a picture I wasn't even sure about myself. I learned how to step back, both literally and in the way it mattered. I didn't stand outside their door when they were on the phone. I didn't ask after every conversation what they'd said. I let silence have its place. That wasn't easy. Sometimes instinct pulled me forward, wanting to protect, wanting to control. But I reminded myself that love isn't always about being the closest one. No one won in those conversations. No one lost either. There was no neat closure, no shared decision made in a single evening. Just overlapping thoughts, feelings not yet named. and I slowly understood that uncertainty isn't the enemy. Sometimes it's the space each person needs to find their own rhythm. One night, after everyone was asleep, I sat alone in the living room and looked around at the familiar things. I could see traces of different seasons layered on top of each other. The years when it was only me, the years with children's laughter added in, and now this stage where everything was beginning to shift. I didn't know how it would end. I didn't know whether today's choices would pull us closer together or push us farther apart. But I knew one thing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to write a script for anyone. I wasn't trying to make this story right by some standard. I was just standing here, ready to receive whatever came, whatever shape it took. And in that acceptance, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I'd just set down a burden I'd always believed I could never put down. I knew we were getting close to a point where things would have to change more clearly. Not right now, but soon. And when that time came, I wanted to have enough calm to neither cling nor push away, just to be there, at the right time, in the right role. The decision didn't arrive in a single day, and it wasn't spoken in one sentence. It formed slowly, through long evenings, through the times Ethan stayed quiet longer than usual, through Lily's eyes whenever she looked at her brother. I didn't ask either of them first. I waited until they spoke on their own, because I had promised myself I wouldn't place more pressure on either one. Ethan was the one who spoke. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of the living room doorway, his hands in his jacket pockets, like he was about to step outside even though it wasn't dark yet. "Grandma," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want to try living with Mom for a while." I looked at him for a long time. There was no impulse in his words, no challenge, just a desire to try, to know, to experience for himself the part of life he'd been missing. Lily didn't say anything right then. She sat in her chair, gripping the hem of her shirt, her eyes fixed on the floor. I turned to her, not asking, "Are you going?" but asking, "How do you feel?" Lily looked up, her eyes wet but her voice very clear. "I want to stay." No explanation, just stay. In that moment, I felt something inside me split in two. One half wanted to keep Ethan here, wanted to say he didn't have to go anywhere to understand where he belonged. The other half understood that if I stopped him, I would only repeat another cycle. It hurt in a very quiet way, but I didn't stop him. I didn't argue, I only nodded. "I'm not holding you," I said to Ethan slowly, letting each word settle. "I'm just opening the door." I saw his shoulders loosen a little, like he'd just been given permission to breathe. Lily turned to look at me, her eyes wavering but not accusing. I placed my hand over hers, felt that familiar warmth, and knew the three of us were stepping into a hard season. Laura didn't promise anything. When I called her to tell her about Ethan's decision, Laura only said she understood. No, everything will be okay. No, don't worry, Mom. Just understood. I didn't know what that meant in real life, but I didn't ask for more. I'd learned that some promises only soothe you for a moment, then leave behind empty spaces that are hard to fill. On the day Ethan left, I helped him pack. Not much. Clothes, a few books, an old pair of headphones. We worked in silence, not because of tension, but because no one wanted to say something too big in a small room. When Laura came to pick him up, we stood on the front porch. Ethan hugged Lily very tightly, longer than I expected. Lily cried, but she didn't cling to her brother's shirt. She stood straight, like she'd decided she wouldn't make things harder. Ethan hugged me last. "I'll call," he said. I nodded and didn't add any warnings or advice. I knew if I started, I wouldn't know where to stop. When the car pulled away, I watched until it disappeared at the end of the road. Then I went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt quiet in a different way. The emptiness showed up fast, not because there was less noise, but because a familiar rhythm was missing. A mug no one used anymore, a pair of shoes no longer in the corner by the door. Lily and I adjusted our routine slowly, like two people learning how to live in a space that had changed shape. I learned to accept that this family no longer had its old form. and maybe never would again. Some evenings, after Lily had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room and listened to the wind outside the window. I didn't blame myself, and I didn't comfort myself either. I just let the emptiness exist without trying to fill it. I understood that emptiness was the price of not clinging, and I accepted paying it. One morning, a few weeks later, I opened the mailbox out front like I always did. Between bills and junk mail, there was a cream-colored envelope, handwriting that felt familiar, but I had to look twice to recognize. My name was written neatly and slowly, as if the writer had weighed every stroke. I stood on the porch for a long time with the envelope in my hand, not opening it right away. I knew that whatever was inside, it would force me to take one more step into this story. And this time, I wasn't sure whether I was ready. I opened the letter in the afternoon, while Lily was still at school, and the house was so quiet I could hear the paper softly rustling in my hands. The envelope wasn't sealed with glue, just carefully folded shut. Inside were a few handwritten pages in Laura's writing, no longer as rushed as I remembered, but still with the familiar rhythm of someone who often pauses mid-sentence to think. There was no apology at the start. No, "Mom, I was wrong," and no words trying to smooth things over. Laura began by admitting her own weakness. She wrote that there had been days she woke up without the strength to even name herself, days when every choice felt heavy as stone. She wrote about the fear of coming back and discovering that everyone was better off without her, a fear that makes someone want to return and disappear at the same time. She didn't blame me, and she didn't blame circumstances. She only wrote that, at certain times, she hadn't been strong enough to do what needed to be done. I read slowly, not because the handwriting was hard, but because I wanted each sentence to have time to settle. In some parts, Laura admitted she had leaned on me, staying like a life preserver, without having the courage to ask how long that life preserver could hold. In other parts, she wrote that when she heard me say, "I'm just opening the door," she understood that some doors can't be pulled toward yourself forever. She wrote that she didn't know where the future would go, but she knew she no longer wanted to hide in silence. There were no promises in the letter, no concrete plan, no clear proposal to rebuild anything, only an admission that she had been weak, afraid, and had chosen to retreat instead of face things. And maybe, for Laura, being able to write that down was already a long distance from 16 years ago. I folded the letter, set it on the table, and sat still. In that moment, I realized I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the relief I'd imagined either, just a different kind of quiet, deeper, with fewer sharp edges. I knew some people need an apology to move forward. I also knew that for some, when an apology comes too late, it can't do what everyone hopes it will. For me, this letter didn't close anything. It only placed another piece of truth on the table. I didn't write back, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to turn Laura's admission into an exchange. I was afraid that if I wrote, I'd accidentally place another burden on her, a burden to respond, to promise, to repair. I chose silence not to punish her, but to give what had just been said room to breathe. I also reminded myself that my memory, what I remember, what I feel, may have been rearranged by the years. The story I tell myself is how I look back, not a sentence handed down to anyone. I wasn't certain enough to judge Laura's motives, and I didn't want to trap the past inside neat conclusions. I only knew how I had lived and the choices I had made within what I was able to do. I put the letter in the drawer, tucked beneath old papers and my worn journal. I didn't lock it away. I didn't hide it. I just stored it there, like something that exists alongside my present life, not something that has to be mentioned every day. Life went on in small rhythms. Lily and I slowly got used to a house with fewer people in it, quieter dinners, slower mornings. I was getting older. That couldn't be denied. But with age, I felt lighter. Not because there was less to do, but because I tried less to control what was never truly mine to control. I learned to let unanswered questions stay where they were, without forcing them to answer right away. Some evenings I sat reading, yellow lamplight falling across the page, and I thought about Laura not with the urge to fix anything, but with a gentle curiosity. What kind of person she might become when she stopped running? I thought about Ethan, about the road he was trying out, and I thought about Lily, who chose to stay but wasn't required to stand still. I realized that this family, even without its old shape, still existed, imperfect but real. When I closed the drawer, I didn't know how this story would end. Maybe there would be more meetings, maybe there wouldn't. Maybe one day I'd write back, or maybe that letter would sit there for a very long time. What I knew for sure was that I no longer needed a clear conclusion in order to keep living. And maybe it was that uncertainty that brought me closer to what I'd been searching for years. A peace that doesn't come from everything being resolved, but from accepting things as they are. I returned the key on a quiet morning when the sun hadn't yet warmed the front step. Laura stood in the doorway holding a cup of cold coffee, looking at me like she was waiting for an opening line. I didn't have one. I just placed the key into her palm and slowly closed her fingers around it. No promises, no conditions, no instructions for the future, just returning something that had once been handed over at a time when we both believed it was temporary. Laura didn't ask why. She nodded lightly as if she understood some decisions don't need explaining. We stood there for a few more seconds, then I turned away. I didn't look back. Not out of coldness, but because I'd learned that in some moments, if you look 1 second longer, you'll want to hold on to more than you should. After that, time moved in a very different rhythm. Ethan visited often. He grew fast, bringing new stories, new questions that no longer searched for permission. We talked like people who know each other well, not to make up for anything, but to stay current with each other. Lily was different. She called, stopped by sometimes, but not regularly. There were long gaps, and I respected them. I understood that everyone keeps connection in their own way, some through presence, some through just enough distance. I lived alone again, not for the first time, but for the first time with a different feeling. The house no longer had to adjust to school schedules, early dinners, or late-night conversations. I rearranged things, not to erase traces, but to make room for the present. Some mornings, I made coffee for one, sat watching sunlight slide across the wooden floor, and realized I wasn't as empty as I'd once feared. I felt full in a quiet way. Our story wasn't complete. It didn't end with a family reunion meal or a promise kept perfectly, but it was real. Real in the way ordinary life usually is, with gaps, things left unsaid, and decisions without a soundtrack. I learned that family isn't about holding tight, but about knowing when to let go. Letting go isn't because the love is gone, but because you love in a way that doesn't leave someone gasping for air. Love doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't promise a gentle ending, but without it, everything is surely hollow. Between those two truths, I chose love with boundaries, a choice that isn't easy but necessary. I also want to say this clearly in the steady voice of someone who has lived long enough to know she can be wrong. The story you've just heard is fictional, pieced together and edited from many slices of real life and human experience, told through my memory and personal interpretation. It isn't meant to confirm objective events. It doesn't represent absolute right and wrong. It doesn't assign motives, and it doesn't encourage anyone to copy what's done here. I'm telling it to reflect, not to judge. If, in real life, you're in a similar situation, pulled between love and boundaries, seek guidance, talk early with the people involved, and set clear boundaries. Slow, kind conversations often save more than rushed decisions. Before I end, I want to thank you for staying with me this far. If you're listening from some city out there, leave me a comment and tell me where you're from. If you've walked through fragile family boundaries, held on, let go, or are learning how to do both, share your experience. Tap like if this story touched you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss other everyday stories, slow, thoughtful, and not quick to conclude. Thank you for listening. Somewhere, maybe very close, I think we're all learning the same lesson. knowing when to hold the key and when to give it back.